I was told to leave my own dining room on Christmas Eve, not gently, not apologetically. My eldest son didn't even look at me when he said it, just kept adjusting the cuffs of his new suit, the one I'd quietly paid for because his bonus was delayed. "Mom, we need the table," he said, as if I were a chair pulled too close. "Why don't you eat later? Or in the kitchen?" The kitchen, where the radiator rattled like an old man's cough and the linoleum curled at the edges like tired lips. The smell of peach cobbler, my recipe passed down from my grandmother, hung thick in the air. Butter, cinnamon, sugar caramelizing just enough to sting the nose. I had been up since dawn, hands aching, back stiff, moving through the house like a ghost with a checklist. No one noticed when I stopped moving. I stood there holding a stack of plates, watching my children rearrange my dining room. They laughed loudly, glasses clinking, heels clicking against hardwood. I had refinished myself 30 years earlier, when my husband was still alive and believed in sanding things slowly. My daughter-in-law finally glanced up. Her smile was thin, polite, practiced. "Oh, sorry," she said. "Did you need something?" Did I need something? I looked down at my hands, veins raised like blue threads, a small burn on my thumb from the cobbler dish, flour under my nails. "No," I said softly, "of course not." I turned, plates trembling, and walked to the kitchen. That was the moment. Not the worst one, but the clearest. That was when I understood I was no longer a person in my own house. I was furniture, useful, quiet, easily moved. I wasn't always this invisible. Once, I was the woman who held everything together with lists and patience and the unglamorous courage of showing up every day. I gave up promotions so I could attend school plays. I stayed in a marriage that dulled me because stability mattered more than passion when you had children who needed shoes and braces and quiet reassurance that tomorrow would look like today. When my husband died, I didn't collapse. I organized. Funeral arrangements, paperwork, grief folded neatly into drawers because someone had to remember which bills were due. I let my children move back temporarily. I let them bring spouses. I let them change the curtains. I let them joke about my old lady collections. The antiques. God, how they loved to mock them. "Mum, why do you keep this junk?" My youngest once laughed, lifting a porcelain figurine with careless fingers. "It looks like something from a haunted house." That figurine had crossed an ocean in my grandmother's suitcase. It had survived a war, a famine, and 3 generations of women who knew how to keep their mouths shut and their eyes open. I smiled then. I always smiled. "Oh, it's nothing," I said. "Just memories." They heard nothing and junk. They never heard investment, foresight, or exit plan. By the time Christmas Eve came around that year, the disrespect was routine. I was excluded from conversations conducted 3 feet away. Family photos were taken without me because I was in the background anyway. My opinions were dismissed with affectionate condescension. "You worry too much, Mum. You wouldn't understand, it's complicated. Just let us handle it." Handle what? My house? My finances? My life? The worst part wasn't the cruelty, it was the assumption. They assumed I was harmless. They assumed I was dependent. They assumed I would never stop yielding. That night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a plate gone cold, I noticed something strange. I wasn't crying. I felt clear. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, the weight of silence settled, not heavy, but sharp. I thought of the safety deposit box I'd opened years earlier. The quiet auction house in another city. The appraisals folded into a manila folder labeled insurance. I thought of Italy. Sunlight on stone, a balcony overlooking water that didn't belong to anyone's children. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel sad. I felt still. They sold my antiques 6 months later while I was on vacation. A surprise, they called it. I came home to empty shelves, pale rectangles on the walls where paintings had hung, dust outlines like ghosts of their former shapes. My daughter-in-law beamed. "We did you a favor," she said. "You always said you didn't want to deal with that clutter." My son added, "We got a decent price, considering. You should thank us." Thank them. I walked slowly through the rooms, my slippers whispering against the floor. Each absence was loud. Each missing piece rang like a bell. Inside, something clicked into place, precise, final. They didn't know. They didn't know the originals had been replaced years ago with replicas so perfect, even experts needed tools to tell the difference. They didn't know the real treasures were already gone, sold discreetly, legally, intelligently. They didn't know I had signed papers with the same calm hands that once packed lunches and buttoned coats. They didn't know their future arguments were already obsolete. I turned to them, smiling the same old smile they had learned to ignore. "Well," I said softly, "I hope you enjoyed yourselves." That night, I slept better than I had in years. There is a peculiar violence in being needed but never seen. It doesn't bruise the skin. It hollows the voice. After Christmas Eve, nothing changed on the surface. I still woke before anyone else. I still made coffee strong enough to cut through resentment and toast just browned at the edges. I still remembered birthdays, dentist appointments, which child hated which vegetable. They still stepped around me the way one steps around a side table, careful not to trip, never curious about its history. The house grew louder without growing warmer. My children spoke over me now, not even pretending otherwise. Conversations paused when I entered, then resumed once I passed. Decisions were made about me, not with me. "We'll renovate the guest room," my eldest announced one evening, scrolling on his phone. "That's my sewing room," I said. He didn't look up. "Well, you don't really use it anymore." I had used it that very morning. But I nodded. I always nodded. Years of nodding had trained them well. At night, alone in my bedroom, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of other people's lives beating inside my walls, laughter that didn't include me, arguments that assumed I wouldn't interfere, the soft click of doors locking, not for safety, but for privacy I was no longer entitled to. I became smaller on purpose. I spoke less. I asked for nothing. I watched everything. Underestimation is a gift if you know how to accept it. They thought my quiet was confusion. They thought my stillness was weakness. They thought age had softened my edges. What they didn't understand was this. I had spent decades running a household on a budget that required foresight, discretion, and timing. I had negotiated with schools, hospitals, insurance companies, and grief itself. Patience wasn't my flaw. It was my training. While they argued about mortgages and promotions and whose turn it was to buy groceries, I observed patterns. Who panicked under pressure? Who lied badly? Who assumed entitlement equaled ownership? I learned exactly how little they knew. The antiques were my favorite joke. They mocked them relentlessly. "That vase is creepy. That clock doesn't even work. Mom, nobody wants this old stuff anymore." I let them believe it. I had replaced the originals slowly, methodically, years earlier, after a casual conversation with an appraiser friend had turned serious. "Do you know what you have?" he'd asked, his voice lowering. I did. I just hadn't known how much. So I planned, one piece at a time. Quiet sales through reputable houses far from our city. Wire transfers that disappeared into accounts my children never questioned because they never bothered to look. They thought I was afraid of technology. I learned it in silence. Every receipt, every document, every signature was filed with the same care I once used to pack school lunches. Nothing forgotten, nothing rushed. When my daughter joked that I'd never survive without them, I smiled and asked her to pass the salt. I had already survived worse. The day they sold the replicas, something in me finally settled. After that, I stopped pretending. Not openly, not yet. But internally, I shifted. I began to withdraw consent. I stopped paying for extras they assumed would be covered. I stopped smoothing over conflicts. I stopped rescuing them from consequences. The first time a bill went unpaid, panic rippled through the house. "Mum," my youngest snapped, "why didn't you handle this?" I met her eyes calmly. "I assumed you had," I said. The confusion on her face was almost comical. They had no idea how much I had been handling. The legal appointment came shortly after. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand, the faint smell of leather and lemon polish in the office, the way the lawyer paused just briefly before saying, "You're very prepared." I nodded. "I've had a long time to think," I said. We discussed ownership, trusts, boundaries, timelines. The words felt heavy and solid, like bricks being laid one by one. When I walked out, the sun felt brighter than usual. For the first time, my future didn't include managing anyone else's comfort. At home, they remained oblivious. They still teased me, still interrupted, still assumed permanence. One evening, my eldest laughed and said, "What would you even do without us, Mum?" I looked at him. Really looked. At the man who had once held my hand crossing the street. At the stranger who now stood in my dining room like he owned it. "I suppose," I said lightly, "I'd find out." He laughed. I didn't. That night I packed a small suitcase. Not to leave, not yet, but to remind myself that I could. Inside I placed my passport. A silk scarf, the deed copies. A single photograph of myself at 25, eyes bright, shoulders straight. I closed the zipper with deliberate care as the sound was soft but final. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud, wasteful. What I felt instead was icy sobriety. The kind that clears the air before a storm. They thought the story was about antiques. They were wrong. It was about ownership, about respect, about the cost of mistaking endurance for dependence. And soon, very soon, they would learn the difference. The moment didn't announce itself with drama. No shouting. No slammed doors. No tears soaking into sleeves. It came disguised as a Tuesday afternoon, grey and unremarkable, the kind of day life hides its sharpest decisions inside. I was folding laundry in the living room, my living room, when my daughter-in-law walked in with her phone already in her hand, eyes gleaming with purpose. "We need to talk," she said. Not can we, need. She didn't sit. She hovered as if authority worked better from above. "We've been discussing the house," she continued, tapping her screen. "The layout isn't practical. Too much wasted space. We think it's time to renovate properly." I folded a towel slowly, aligning the edges with care. "What do you mean by we?" I asked. She smiled. "The family." "Ah, and what do you mean by renovate?" She exhaled, impatient. "Sell, or at least refinance. The market's good. We can put the money to better use." There it was. Not concern. Not inclusion. Extraction. I placed the towel on the stack and finally looked up at her. "This house isn't an asset," I said quietly. "It's my home." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Come on," she said. "You don't need all this. You're alone most of the time anyway." Alone. In a house full of people. Something in me hardened, not painfully but cleanly, like metal cooling after a forge. I realized then that yielding had trained them to believe I didn't own even my own boundaries. And I was done teaching that lesson. That evening, the family meeting happened without invitation. I was called into the dining room, the same table I'd been banished from months earlier. They sat together, shoulders aligned, a united front rehearsed in advance. My eldest spoke first. "Mom, we think it's time to be practical." I pulled out a chair and sat. "I agree," I said. They blinked. "We're adults now," he continued. "We're carrying responsibilities. It makes sense for assets to serve the family." Assets. Not on home. Not history. I nodded again. "You're right," I said. Their relief was immediate, sloppy. My daughter leaned forward. "So you'll sign?" I tilted my head. "Sign what?" "The papers," she said. "We already talked to someone." Already talked to someone. I smiled, a small, precise thing. "I'd like to review everything with my lawyer first," I said. The room cooled. My youngest scoffed. "Why? We're family." That word had become a weapon. "Exactly," I said, "which is why clarity matters." Silence pressed in. They weren't used to resistance. They mistook calm for consent. But I wasn't asking. I was informing. The next morning, I changed my routine. I woke at my usual hour but didn't start coffee for everyone. I made 1 cup. Just 1. The smell felt indulgent. I dressed carefully. Lipstick for the first time in years. Sensible heels that clicked softly against the floor, not announcing but reminding. When my son asked where I was going, I said, "Out." No explanation. I spent the day doing things that had waited too long. I opened a new bank account in my name alone. I transferred funds they didn't know existed. I updated beneficiaries. Each action felt like reclaiming a square inch of ground. The legal documents were heavier than I expected when I picked them up later that week. The paper smelled faintly of ink and authority. Ownership, control, exit options. The lawyer slid them across the desk. "When you're ready," he said. I was already ready. At home, tension simmered. They noticed the changes. I wasn't where they expected me to be. Money didn't appear on schedule. Decisions stalled without my silent approval. "You're acting strange," my daughter said one night. I smiled mildly. "Am I?" "You're being distant." I set down my book. "I'm being precise." They didn't like that. People who benefit from your silence resent your clarity. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I returned from lunch to find a stranger in my living room measuring the walls. "Who is this?" I asked. My eldest barely glanced up from his phone. "Contractor, just getting estimates." Without asking, without permission. In my house. I walked over, extended my hand. "Thank you for coming," I said politely to the man. "But this won't be necessary." He looked confused. "I was hired." "By people who don't own this property," I said. The room froze. My son stood abruptly. "What did you say?" I turned to him, heart steady. "I said," I repeated calmly, "this house is not yours to offer." The air thickened, electric. My daughter-in-law laughed nervously. "Mom, don't be dramatic." I reached into my bag and felt the edges of the folder. The weight of it was reassuring. "No," I said. "This is me being exact." That night, alone in my room, I opened the folder once more. The documents didn't sparkle. They didn't shout. They simply were. Truth doesn't need volume. I slept deeply. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning release. They thought they were pushing an old woman. They didn't realize they were standing on a trapdoor I'd built years ago, quietly, patiently, legally. And soon, I would open it. Power does not arrive with noise. It arrives with paperwork. The first thing I did was stop explaining myself. I did not argue. I did not justify. I did not soften my words to make them easier to swallow. I let confusion do the work for me. My children circled me like anxious birds for days after the contractor incident. Questions came, wrapped as concern, irritation masked as jokes. "You're overreacting. This is unnecessary stress. Why are you suddenly involving lawyers?" Suddenly. As if preparation were a phase, not a discipline. I answered none of it directly. Instead, I moved. The lawyer's office became familiar territory, quiet, neutral, respectful. No one interrupted me there. No one laughed when I spoke. We revised everything. The house confirmed solely in my name. The finances separated cleanly, surgically. The trust activated with conditions my children would not enjoy. I remember the sound of the stamp hitting paper. Dull, final, the smell of toner, the faint creak, then of the chair as I leaned back, lighter with every page signed. "You've protected yourself thoroughly," the lawyer said. I met his eyes. I protected myself late. He didn't argue. At home, the temperature dropped. They felt it before they understood it. The credit card declined first. My youngest stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, face pale. "That's impossible," she snapped into the receiver. "Try it again." She looked at me then, suspicion flickering. "Did you do something?" I took a sip of tea, chamomile, steady. "I adjusted my responsibilities," I said. Her mouth tightened. "You can't just—" "I can," I said calmly. "And I did." The word "can't" had lost its power over me. The entitlement unraveled quickly once money stopped cushioning it. Arguments erupted between them now, sharp, frantic, poorly aimed. They blamed each other. For bills, for assumptions, for promises made on foundations that were never theirs. I watched from the margins, not with satisfaction but with clarity. This was not punishment. This was consequence. The formal notices went out the following week. Not dramatic, not cruel, precise. Aliter to each of them. Clear language, legal weight. They gathered in the living room again, my living room, papers shaking in their hands. "What is this?" my eldest demanded. I stood near the window, sunlight outlining my reflection in the glass. For once I didn't look, tired. "It's notice," I said, "of boundaries." "You're evicting us," my daughter-in-law shrieked. I turned slowly. "Why, I'm reclaiming my home." Silence slammed down like a door. "You wouldn't," my youngest whispered. "We're family." I walked to the table and placed my hand flat against the wood. "This house," I said evenly, "was paid for with years you never thanked me for. It is not a group, project, and family does not mean ownership." Myson's voice shook. "Where are we supposed to go?" I considered him carefully. "That," I said, "is not my problem anymore." The words did not sting when I said them. They liberated. That night, I packed openly. No hiding, no guilt. I boxed things that mattered. I left what didn't. I found old photographs tucked into drawers, smiling faces, arms around shoulders, promises no, one remembered making. I kept one picture, me, standing alone at the edge of a lake, hair blowing free. Everything else went back. They tried manipulation next. Tears, anger, public shame. Relatives called. "What's wrong with you? They're struggling. You're being heartless." I listened politely. Then I asked one simple question. "Where were you when I was erased in my own home?" The line always went quiet. The final legal meeting was brief. The plan was airtight. The timelines enforced. The leverage absolute. When I left the office, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. At home, the house began to empty. Boxes scraped against floors, doors slammed, voices rose and fell, then disappeared altogether. On the last night, my eldest stood in the doorway. "You planned this," he said bitterly. I met his gaze. "I survived this," I corrected. He left without another word. The house was silent for the first time in years. Not lonely, peaceful. I walked through each room slowly, touching walls, breathing in dust and polish and memory. In the study, I opened the small safe one last time. Inside were copies of documents they had never known existed. And beneath theme a photograph, of a sun-washed villa overlooking the Italian coast. Purchased. Paid for. Waiting. I closed the door softly. The board was set. They still thought the story was about a house. They had no idea the real reveal hadn't even begun. The truth has a sound. It is not loud. It does not shout. It sounds like a folder opening in a quiet room, like the soft slide of paper across polished wood, like breath leaving a chest that thought it had more time. I heard that sound 3 weeks after the house emptied. They came back, not together, not coordinated, but desperate enough to forget pride. One by one, they circled, testing the edges of a reality they no longer controlled. The first was my eldest. He stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, the expensive suit gone. The smell of stale coffee clung to him. Stress had aged him quickly. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside and let him in. I did not offer tea. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same one I had once been exiled from. Sunlight fell between us like a line drawn on the floor. "I didn't realize things were this bad," he began. "The housing market collapsed, the refinancing fell through. We thought—" "You thought," I said gently, "that what was mine would save you." He swallowed. "We just need some time." I nodded. "That's exactly what you've already taken." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand how hard this is." I leaned back. "Oh," I said softly, "I understand perfectly." I stood and walked to the study. The folder waited where I had left it. When I returned, I placed it on the table between us. "What's this?" he asked. "Closure," I said. I opened it. Appraisals, auction confirmations, bank transfers. His eyes scanned the pages, confusion giving way to disbelief. "These dates," he whispered. "Years ago," I said. "You sold the antiques," his voice cracked. "All of them?" I corrected him. "I sold the real ones." The silence that followed was immense. "But we sold them," he stammered. "We already—" "Sold replicas," I said calmly. "Very convincing ones. I had them made after the first appraisal." He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "You tricked us." I shook my head. "No," I said. "I protected myself. The others arrived soon after. Panic has a way of coordinating people better than love ever did." They sat together this time, no longer confident, no longer aligned, eyes darting, hands trembling, voices brittle. My daughter spoke first. "You lied to us." I met her gaze. "You never asked." My daughter-in-law scoffed. "So what? You made some money. That doesn't give you the right to destroy us." I slid one final document forward. The deed. An Italian notary stamp gleamed faintly. "What's this?" my youngest whispered. "My home," I said. Their faces drained of colour. "You bought a villa," my eldest said hoarsely. "I funded my future," I replied, "with assets you dismissed as junk." The room tilted for them. I could see it, the recalculation, the panic, the dawning horror. All those jokes. All that arrogance. All that certainty. Gone. "You could have helped us," my daughter said, voice breaking. I folded my hands. "I helped you for decades," I said evenly. "I paid in years, in silence, in self-erasure. This was not abandonment. This was retirement." They didn't cry then. They stared. Because the worst part wasn't the money. It was the realization that I had never been helpless. I had simply been quiet. The checkmate wasn't cruel. It was complete. The house, mine. The funds, untouchable. The future, secured. There was nothing left for them to argue. When they left that day, they did so slowly as if gravity had increased. At the door, my eldest turned. "You planned all of this?" I nodded. "Yes, He hesitated. Do you feel good about it? I considered the question honestly, but no, I said. I feel free. That night, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a day that mattered. I sat alone at the table, the chair no longer empty, the space no longer hostile. I raised my glass, not in celebration but acknowledgement, to foresight, to boundaries, to women who learn late but learn thoroughly. Outside, the house rested quietly. Inside, my phone buzzed with flight confirmations. Italy was waiting. And for the first time in my life, so was I. Consequences are rarely loud. They don't arrive with sirens or shouting. They seep in, quietly, the way cold moves through. Stone, slow, inevitable, impossible to ignore. I heard about my children the way one hears about distant weather. Indirectly, without urgency, I, no longer responsible for preparation. The eldest lost his house first. The refinancing he'd counted on never materialized. The market tightened. Friends who once applauded his smart investments stopped returning calls. The suit disappeared, replaced by worn jackets and a careful, brittle humility. My daughter's marriage fractured under financial pressure. She called once, voice shaking, and asking if I could just help with the lawyer. I closed my eyes. I already paid for my mistakes, I said gently. You'll have to pay for yours. She hung up without saying goodbye. My youngest moved back in with friends, then strangers. The entitlement drained from her, quickly. When you are no longer buffered by someone else's labor, the world sharpens. I didn't rejoice in any of it. I observed. That was the difference. Socially, the narrative tried to turn against me. Cold. Unnatural. A mother who abandoned her children. I let it. I had learned the cost of defending myself to people invested in misunderstanding me. When relatives whispered, I stopped attending. When acquaintances questioned, I smiled and changed the subject. My life no longer required witnesses. The house sold quietly. Not for rescue money. Not for compromise. For transition. The final walk-through was strange. Empty rooms echoed with memory, not regret. I touched the doorway where I'd once measured growing children. I paused in the kitchen where I'd eaten, and alone on Christmas Eve. The pain no longer lived there. I locked the door without ceremony. Italy did not feel like escape. It felt like arrival. The villa was exactly as promised, stone warmed by centuries of sun, floors cool beneath bare, feet, air heavy with citrus and sea salt. Mornings began with church bells drifting across water. Evenings ended with wine and silence that held no accusation. I learned the names of flowers again. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired, spoke when I had something to say. No one interrupted me. No one needed me to disappear. Letters came at first for hours, then emails, then nothing. Absence, I learned, can be a form of respect. I planted an olive tree in the garden that first spring. The soil stained my hands dark and honest. I pressed the roots down firmly, deliberately. This one, the gardener said, will outlive us. I smiled. That's the idea. At night, I sometimes think of the woman I was. The one who mistook endurance for love. The one who believed self-sacrifice was a moral obligation rather than a choice. I don't despise her. She did what she knew how to do. But I am not her anymore. The moral came quietly, like most truths do. Love without boundaries becomes consumption. Silence is not kindness when it erases you. And self-respect, learned late, is still worth everything. I did not ruin my children. I simply stopped saving them from the consequences of forgetting who I was. And in doing so, I finally saved myself. There is a moment just before dawn when the world feels undecided. The sea outside my bedroom window rests without urgency. The shutters breathe with the wind. Light gathers slowly as if asking permission to exist. I wake early now, not out of habit but because I want to. I make coffee the Italian way, thick and unapologetic, and drink it standing barefoot on stone that remembers centuries. Somewhere below, a fisherman prepares his nets. Somewhere above, swallows stitch the sky together. No one is waiting for me to be useful. And that is the greatest luxury I have ever known. I used to believe motherhood was forever surrender. That to be good, you had to be smaller, quieter, less. I was wrong. Motherhood is stewardship, not ownership, and stewardship ends. Letting go does not mean failing. It means finishing. The last message came a year after I left. It was from my eldest. Short, unadorned. I understand now. I didn't before. I hope you're well. I read it once. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but completion. Some chapters don't need replies, they need space. I host dinners now. Friends, neighbours, strangers who become familiar through shared bread and laughter. I cook, peach cobbler sometimes, still warm, still fragrant, but I eat it at the table, not alone in a kitchen. When people ask about my children, I say they are grown. Nothing more, nothing less. The villa fills with light every afternoon, golden and forgiving. I read books I once meant to read. I write letters I don't always send. I walk without destination. I exist without apology. And when I look in the mirror, I recognize the woman looking back. She is not invisible. She is not furniture. She is not waiting. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this. Do not wait to be respected. Do not teach people how to erase you. And do not confuse love with endurance. Boundaries are not cruelty, shunks. Silence is not peace. And self-love is not selfish, it is survival. I was underestimated because I allowed it. I am free because I stopped. The sea moves. The bells ring. Morning arrives. And this time the day belongs to me.